It has been a few days since Prehistoric Planet Ice Age had officially released. I talked about each individual episode in its own little self contained review, but now I want to talk about the show as a whole. Was this a good season of Prehistoric Planet? Is it a worthy continuation from the first two seasons that were completely Maastrichtian focused? Well, let's go ahead and find out. So the first thing I want to talk about is the sort of technical side of this show. The CGI and the animations. Prehistoric Planet is very well known for its amazing CGI and its amazing animations. Everything about the first two seasons were incredibly lifelike and seemingly realistic. They set the bar incredibly high, and as a result, many other documentaries are just automatically compared to the first two seasons of Prehistoric Planet. Does this one hold a candle in terms of the technical side? Yes, I think it does, and in a lot of ways, I think that it kind of exceeds it. We get a lot of amazing animals here. There's a lot of fantastic creatures that finally get the spotlight, and their designs were amazing. First of all, I love their designs, but we're not going to talk about that so much right here. That'll be the next section. Rather, the quality of the CGI was just top notch. Whether it be feathers, whether it be fur, or whether it be scales, everything I thought looked just as good as it potentially could. Even close-ups were just immaculate, like you were close up to maybe a Gigantopithecus, and it's like, wow, I'm literally close up to a Gigantopithecus. This is amazing. So that probably just goes without saying that, yeah, the Prehistoric Planet Ice Age CGI is amazing. The animations were also a huge highlight. I mentioned this a few times in my singular reviews, but there was just something about the animal movements that felt really grounded and just based in realism. My biggest highlight was the Gigantopithecus movements, the way that it just kind of like moves around like it is a giant hulking great ape, the way that it kind of just sits down and it's like messing with random things, or how it scratches its eye. It felt very realistic. They went above and beyond in terms of like portraying how these animals move, and it seems like they really put in some extra care to ensure that they moved like real animals would move. There were a lot of cats in this, and a lot of them felt like they had very realistic cat movements. With the dogs, when they showed up, the Anacyon dirus, when they showed up, it felt like they had very realistic dog movements. Not all of the movements were perfect. I heard some people mention that like the squirrel movements seemed a little bit off, and I could probably agree. Sometimes like squirrels in real life are kind of like really jittery creatures. Like sometimes it doesn't even seem like they focus on anything. There's like a lot of times where this squirrel, it seems like it was like really focusing on different things. It felt a little bit more anthropomorphized. It is where I think a lot of the complaints come from. But even that's just kind of like a minor thing because it didn't really bug me too much. Everything else I thought lined up very nicely. So yes, I do think that this season kind of does hold a candle to the first two seasons in terms of its overall quality. It just feels like you are watching real life animals. It looks like a documentary crew figured out how to do time travel, and instead of sharing it with the world, they decided to go back in time to film animals that are now extinct. That's how realistic the CGI looks, and it helps ground you in the story. Not to mention the fact that we can have more live action footage of modern day animals because of the fact that they lived alongside the extinct ones. That also helps ground it too, because, for example, one of my favorite shots is the caribou right next to the megaloceros. That's just something that, it's like, oh, I know that animal. Oh, hey, there's the megaloceros. Wow, the megaloceros CGI looks amazing. It's just something that helps ground it. And it obviously puts things into perspective, just how different extinct animals are from the ones that we know and love today. It also shows how close we were to seeing these animals, which is also pretty sad. So yeah, CGI is amazing, animations are amazing. That probably kind of went without saying. Now, what about accuracy and speculation? Now, the first two seasons of Prehistoric Planet were big on speculation. It was sort of the all yesterdays method, where you sort of take some risks and add some creativity to your dinosaur portrayals. A lot of that includes like the throat balloons on Dreadnoughtus, or certain behaviors that some animals exhibited. Most of the speculation did stem from the behaviors, because behaviors, those are not things that really fossilize too frequently. So a lot of time you do need to be a little bit more speculative if you're going to portray them on screen. Some of that does apply here, of course, but with here, a lot of times these extinct animals are a little bit more similar to ones that we have today. Like back to the Gigantopithecus, if you base its movements and its behaviors off of real life or modern day apes, rather, then it would feel like it was an actual ape. Or with all of the cats, if you base their movements and behaviors off of modern day cats, then, again, that feels a little bit more grounded. Same goes for the elephants that we see or some of the birds that we see. Ice Age animals, they do have more modern day analogs than dinosaurs do. Like, there's really nothing that's too similar to a Tyrannosaurus Rex, for example. However, there are a lot of things that are similar to Arctodus or to Arctotherium, these giant short faced bears. Obviously, there's a lot of analogs today that are pretty similar to them, modern day bears. So I think it becomes a little bit easier to portray like behaviors and movements that make a little bit more sense and is a little bit more like we're a little bit more willing to accept when watching on screen because we are a bit more familiar with these animals that are portrayed in the Pleistocene. So I don't think that they really took too many big risks in terms of the speculation. There's been a few things that I've seen some people mention a couple of times that might be considered speculation, like the fact that Thylacoleo or Thylacoleo, it doesn't matter how I say it, people are going to get mad at me either way. They're portrayed in a pack, which many people didn't know that we actually do have some evidence for. Apparently, there's like some caves with a bunch of Thylacoleo scratches on the cave walls, as well as like a bunch of fossils found in the same general area, which might indicate that there was some social behaviors with Thylacoleo. If you haven't noticed, I'm going back and forth in terms of the pronunciation because no matter how I say it, people get upset with me. So yeah, in terms of like speculation, while there are a few bits here and there that could fall under that flag, things were relatively grounded as far as these portrayals went. Obviously, we can't know for sure if a lot of these animals acted the way that they did, but it's not like anything too crazy happened on screen. Especially with the first two seasons, it really did feel like they did take some huge jumps in terms of like how they wanted to portray these animals. They didn't really do that here. Again, a lot of this was relatively grounded, and it seemed like it was mostly based off of a lot of modern day analogs. The animal designs were very top notch, though. I practically loved every single design that happened in this documentary. That happened? Well, every single design that showed up in this documentary. I loved the Anasaon, those being the dire wolves. I loved the Columbian mammoth. I loved both species of Smilodon, Fatalis and Populator. I loved all of the sloths that showed up. I loved the giant moa. I loved the Procoptodon. I loved the Diprotodon. You get the point. I thought that there was a lot of fantastic designs here. And you could probably bring up some nitpicks here and there. I've already heard a few nitpicks when it comes to the woolly mammoth. It does seem like that it's possible that its trunk is a little bit shrink wrapped towards the front. And it might even be possible that woolly mammoths had counter shading. So that might be an inaccuracy in that design too. But generally speaking, when it comes to like the broad strokes and when you're just looking at it, it is a very good mammoth design. And the same could probably be said for practically every single design that shows up in this documentary. There's probably a lot of nitpicks that you can apply to a lot of designs. The same was true with the first two seasons. The T-Rex is not perfect. The Edmontosaurus certainly wasn't perfect. The Machikosaurus, there was a lot of improvements that could have been done to make them a little bit more accurate. But of course, there's like a lot of things that go into the behind the scenes production of these animals and how to actually properly portray them through a CGI model. Now, one of the biggest inaccuracies that I talked about in my deserts review was the fact that the Megalania did have a slit pupil, or two slit pupils, because it has two eyes. That's obviously not correct. Varanids don't have slit pupils. They do have rounded pupils. There's no reason to think that Megalania would be the exception, considering the fact that it would be in the minority there. That was a mistake, according to Darren Naish. It was something that apparently happened early on in the development of the Megalania model, and they failed to catch it before, the final product had released, before it was too late to actually change it. So it is an inaccuracy, but apparently it's a mistake. And I'm sure if you looked at each of these designs long enough, you would probably find some things that you aren't exactly on board with and some things that could be improved upon. But from what I gather from all of the designs that I've looked closely enough at, there's really not too much of that. But then there's also some animals that are known from fragmentary remains that there was, they had to fill in a lot of the gaps in their own way. The biggest example is Gigantopithecus, my favorite creature from this whole show. The Gigantopithecus, it's a famous animal because it's the largest ape to ever exist. And so a lot of people, they like to portray it and things like that. But the only problem is that we don't really know what Gigantopithecus looked like. If we only know it from jaw material, lower jaw, and from a lot of teeth. So you have to fill in a lot of those gaps by using other animals. Now, it is very commonly known that Gigantopithecus, like its closest modern day relative, are the orangutans. So because we don't really know much of its overall anatomy, a lot of people like to portray it as a giant orangutan, which is a fine depiction to take. That's probably a safe depiction to take because, that's going off of phylogenetic bracketing mostly. There are a lot of older depictions that made it look like Bigfoot, kind of like walking upright, swinging its arms like a regular, like a human, basically. Those are obviously way less likely given the fact that it is a giant ape, and great apes, they are quadrupedal. They walk around on all fours. Now, I really liked this depiction because it felt like its own creature. It didn't really feel like too much like an orangutan, which I won't ever get mad at a giant orangutan depiction. But it also did not feel too much like a gorilla. There are some aspects about it that do kind of look like a gorilla, like, mainly with its skull shape. But even that's kind of reaching because the skull is still distinct from a gorilla's. Gorillas have a little bit more of an elongated cranium, that kind of ends in a little bit more of a point. This one seems a little bit more robust, and it doesn't have nearly as large of a nose. And there are just some things that are quite a bit different from a gorilla. So in a lot of ways, our beautiful Gigantopithecus here feels like it's just its own ape, a distinct ape. It's not too much like any other ape that we know of today. And that was a great route to take, and I loved it. And just that paired with the fact that its movements were perfect, I really liked the Gigantopithecus section. I've been that's what's been on my mind the most ever since watching this show. So accuracy and just the overall depictions of these animals, that was pretty dang good. But in that same vein, when it comes to accuracy, there's something that could be considered, well, I don't know if you can consider it inaccurate. It's more so messy. That's how they reveal these animals. So one of my biggest complaints, I'm sure many of you have heard many times in my videos, is that they fail to actually reveal what animal you're looking at on screen. Like, they don't give it its actual name. There's a lot of giant fossa or giant sloth or giant otter. There's just a lot of like very basic common names that they apply to these animals instead of giving you the actual specific name. We get a few different species of sloth in here. We get Megalonyx, I believe Diablotherium, and we get a Eurymetherium. They're never actually given their name. Instead, they're all just called some variation of sloth. There's these little kangaroo fellas from the Australian episode, or the deserts episode, that actually never gets name drop either. And especially with the bears, it probably gets really confusing for some people because they just call them, there's two bears, there's a few bears, but in terms of like the big bears, there's two types of short-faced bears that show up, and they're both just called short-faced bears. One of them is Arctodus, one of them is Arctotherium. They are distinct from each other, but we're never told that. The same thing applies to like the armadillos. They're called giant armadillos, essentially. One of them is Glyptotherium, one of them is Doedicurus. Again, aside from the fact that they look completely different, like with the fact that Doedicurus has a huge spiked club, they don't actually establish that this is a different animal than the one we saw beforehand. And that is something that I find annoying, especially in a documentary, something that is supposed to be educational. Now, I know that Darren Naish has said that that's not at the fault of the science writers. And I guarantee it wasn't the fault of the science writers. Rather, that's more so the TV people who probably fear that they don't want their audience to be confused or to be overcome by all of these big names. But I just still find that very annoying. And I find that annoying that a lot of these, quote unquote TV people would make that decision because it kind of like hinders the absolute potential of your documentary. In that same vein, this documentary is a little bit of a mess in terms of like jumping from one location to the next. The first two seasons had this problem as well. They don't properly establish where in the world you are, and they cut to different sections fairly quickly and like fairly abruptly. Take, for example, in the very first episode, we're spending a lot of time in the caves. Now, these caves take place in Eurasia, likely around Europe, because we see animals like Megaloceros or Panthera spelaea. We spend a huge chunk of time there, but then it abruptly cuts to Megalonyx, also in a little bit of a snowy environment. Now, if you were just watching the show, you would probably expect that Megalonyx lived in the same general area as all of these cave animals. But that's not true. Megalonyx was a North American sloth. But per my memory, they don't actually establish that in the documentary. They're just hard cut to the next section. And so, again, a lot of people might be under the assumption that Megalonyx was also a European animal. If we even established that we were in Europe in the first place, because I don't think we did that unless I'm forgetting it. Another big example, and I've seen this one trip a lot of people up several times on the internet so far, is in the deserts episode where we spend the majority of the episode in Australia, looking at giant short-faced kangaroos, looking at giant wombat relatives, looking at megalania, and then it cuts to New Zealand, in a deserty section with the giant moa. Now, you would probably assume that the giant moa lived in Australia as well, because we don't actually get it established that we've gone to a different part of the world. Instead, it's just one deserty environment with specific animals onto the next deserty environment with specific animals. The giant moa did not live in Australia. It lived in New Zealand. But if you're watching the episode and just going off of what they're showing you, you would think that they lived in Australia if we even established that we were in Australia in the first place, because I don't even think we did that. I could be wrong, but I don't think we did. In fact, there was just a huge lack of telling you where we are in the world. Even some simple text would help with that. Like, once you switch scenes, put on some text in the bottom left corner or something like that, or maybe in the center of the screen, to let us know that we're in a different part of the world, and so that everybody can kind of adjust their brain, and then maybe they'd learn something a little bit more about a different part of the world. Like, wouldn't it really be cool to find out the interesting fauna that lived in New Zealand during this point in time, like especially with animals like the Haas eagle? It'd be a little bit easier for them to kind of dive into that if they know where we are in that portion of the episode. Those are my absolute biggest complaints with the show. Everything else is beautiful, but those are fairly decently sized complaints, And, I kind of waved it off a few times in the reviews, but now that I've thought about it a little bit more, it is kind of messy. Because, people like me who spend a lot of time reading about this stuff, watching videos, attending lectures and things like that, you have a good idea that, now we're in a different part of the world. When I see Megalonyx show up, even though they don't call it Megalonyx, they just call it a ground sloth. But when I see that fella show up, I know I'm not in Europe anymore. But the average person who's just watching that is not going to know. And documentaries are meant to be educational. So we need to be a little bit more, nitpicky, or we need to offer more criticism when they do things like that, because it's simply just messy. And I love for people to learn more about these animals. And if you give them the proper tools, it'll be easier for them to do that. So yeah, those are just my main complaints of the show. It obviously doesn't ruin the quality of it, because you still get amazing moments. But it is something that is just a little bit unfortunate. So what do I rate this show out of 10? What does Dino Guy, what is his overall rating of it? I think I give it a solid 8 or 9 out of 10, possibly more so in the 8 range. I loved it. I seriously flippin' loved it. I'm going to be rewatching these episodes a lot. I've already been rewatching a lot of clips on YouTube, especially of my boy Gigantopithecus, because I just had so much fun with it. I've always wanted a documentary kind of like this in this way, and I hope that we get to see more in the future that are set in different time periods. Paleozoic, that whole era would be amazing to see. I would love to see Jurassic and Triassic, but this was still flat out amazing. I just love seeing a lot of my favorite animals finally get their chance to shine on a screen. Just on a screen, I guess. It was awesome. I really loved it. So just a great documentary. Obviously, it's not perfect. There's really no such thing as perfect. The first two seasons were not perfect either. But yeah, no, it was great. I highly recommend you check it out if you have not already. But that is pretty much all I have for this one. Thank you guys so much for watching. Thank you so much for watching all of my Prehistoric Planet content. I had so much fun making it. This was just a really fun show to dive into. But I hope to see you in the next video. Have an awesome day.